in a massive show of strength at a time of increasing political and economic turmoil around the world. The Chinese president opened the 9th Forum of China-Africa Cooperation in Beijing as he seeks to position his country as the development partner of choice for the global South.
The friendship between China and Africa transcends time and space, surmounts mountains and oceans. And
China just announced a massive $51 billion investment into Africa, and the West is getting nervous. During a recent summit in Beijing, Chinese President Xi Jinping made some big promises, including creating at least 1 million jobs in Africa. But why is this stirring up so much anxiety in the Western countries? Well, it's not just about money. Many in the West see this as part of China's larger game plan to challenge the global dominance of the US and its allies, and Africa is a key part of this strategy. For example, between 2006 and 2021, China poured a staggering $191 billion into African nations, making it the continent's biggest trading partner. The fear is that China is trying to shift Africa's reliance away from the West and onto itself, which would weaken Western influence in the region. At the same time, China gains access to Africa's rich resources, minerals, fuels, and metals that are crucial for its growing economy. Some experts think that this is part of China's long-term goal to eventually surpass the US as the world's leading superpower. But there are other ways to look at it. Some argue that China might simply be trying to jumpstart its own slowing economy, which is dealing with major challenges like an aging population. And others believe that this partnership is more of a win-win deal between countries in the global south who feel left out by a global system that mainly benefits the West. Whatever the true motive, the growing China-Africa relationship is a big deal, and the rest of the world is definitely paying attention.
Decolonization was more or less the forgotten continent. Western countries did not want to engage it for whatever reason. China went in. China treated every African country as brother and sister, and China really invested hugely in Africa. Now, many other countries are talking about engaging with Africa, including the United States, many European countries, India, for example. The more the better, because Africa should not be a monopoly for any other country, not for China, not for anyone else. Africa is for the African people.
Africa has spoken not with words, but with actions that echo through every corridor of global power. For decades, Europe dictated, manipulated, and monopolized the destiny of Africa. They wrote the contracts, dictated the trade, controlled the currencies, and reaped the rewards. But today, a seismic shift is shaking the foundations of that centuries-old dominance, and it is coming from the very continent they once underestimated. Africa, in alliance with China and Asia, is rewriting the rules of global economics, tearing through colonial structures, and forging a future where the wealth of the continent serves its people, not its former masters. It started quietly. Trade routes began to shift. Ports once managed by European conglomerates now welcome Asian partners under African terms. Massive railway projects stretch across the savannah, powered by Chinese engineering and African ambition. From Nairobi to Lagos, from Addis Ababa to Johannesburg, something unstoppable is unfolding, an economic realignment that's shaking the Western world to its core. In European boardrooms, panic whispers have turned into urgent meetings. CEOs who once bragged about owning the African market now stare at collapsing profit charts. European banks, which for decades extracted wealth through interest-heavy loans, are suddenly irrelevant. Why? Because Africa is now turning east, where deals are made not with colonial strings, but with shared interests. Across the continent, governments have realized the truth. Europe's aid was a leash. Its investment was a trap. But Asia came with a different playbook. China offered partnership, not pity. India offered technology, not lectures. South Korea offered infrastructure, not interference. And now Africa stands taller, no longer asking for help, but choosing its allies. In the last decade alone, trade between Africa and Asia has exploded past $400 billion, dwarfing European involvement. China has built over 10,000 kilometers of rail and road networks, not just for extraction, but for connection, connecting African nations to one another and to the global market under new terms. Industrial parks in Ethiopia, special economic zones in Zambia, manufacturing hubs in Ghana, all humming with activity, are reshaping Africa into a global production powerhouse. And Europe is losing its grip. France, once the self-proclaimed guardian of Francophone Africa, now faces defiance from its former colonies. The CFA franc, that colonial relic that kept African economies tethered to Paris, is being discarded one by one. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have already rejected it. Senegal and Ivory Coast are re-evaluating. Europe's economic claws are slipping, and it is happening faster than anyone in Brussels can comprehend. But what truly terrifies Europe is not just losing access to Africa's resources, it is losing control over Africa's narrative. For the first time in modern history, Africa is dictating its economic agenda without asking for permission. When China and Africa convene in summits like the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation (FOCAC), European media watches in disbelief. For decades, Africa's major agreements were signed in Paris, London, or Washington. Now they're signed in Beijing, Nairobi, and Addis Ababa. Behind closed doors, Western diplomats call it the new scramble for Africa. But they're wrong. This isn't a scramble. It's liberation, economic, technological, and psychological. Africa is no longer being divided by outsiders. It's being united by purpose. Look at the data. Africa's industrial growth rate has doubled since 2010. Manufacturing output is up 45%. In Nigeria, local production of electric vehicles is underway with Asian backing. Kenya's green energy revolution, backed by Chinese solar and wind technology, is making it one of the world's renewable energy leaders. Tanzania and Zambia are processing their own lithium for batteries, no longer shipping raw ore to Europe for pennies. These are not isolated wins, this is the birth of a continental transformation. For centuries, Europe's economic empire survived on African raw materials. Gold, cocoa, coffee, cobalt, oil, all extracted cheaply and sold dearly. But now, Africa is flipping that model. Factories are being built on African soil. Refineries, smelters, and tech parks are emerging across the continent. Africa is no longer exporting raw wealth, it's exporting finished power. In 2025, when Ghana launched its first locally refined gold-backed currency, the Afro-Gold, Europe called it economic rebellion. But across the continent, it was hailed as a revolution. For the first time, Africa's wealth backed its own value, and that sent a shockwave through global markets. Meanwhile, China has become Africa's largest trading partner and the architect of much of its new infrastructure. But contrary to Western propaganda, this isn't debt diplomacy, it's strategy. African nations are leveraging partnerships with China and Asia to build schools, ports, and technology hubs. In return, Africa gains what Europe never offered: industrialization, and the results are undeniable. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfTA, the world's largest single market by member countries, is amplifying this momentum, with over 1.4 billion people and a combined GDP projected to hit $3.5 trillion. Africa is not waiting for permission to join the global stage, it is creating its own stage. And guess who's in the front row? Not Europe, not the US, it's Asia. While Europe debates how to contain Chinese influence in Africa, African leaders are signing billion-dollar deals in green energy, manufacturing, and tech innovation. The new African dream is not built on Western approval, it's built on African confidence. A confidence that Europe can no longer manipulate. In Senegal, a $2.3 billion deep-sea port built with Chinese collaboration is opening Africa's western coast to massive trade flows. In Kenya, high-speed trains link industrial cities in record time. In Nigeria, new refineries mean independence from imported fuel. In Ethiopia, the Grand Renaissance Dam, financed and engineered through non-Western partnerships, is providing electricity to millions. Every one of these projects chips away at Europe's dominance, not with protests or wars, but with progress. That's the new weapon: economic independence. Europe's reaction? Panic disguised as diplomacy. They've started sending delegations, promising renewed partnerships and equal cooperation. But Africans now see through it: equal. After centuries of exploitation, Europe is not coming with equality, it's coming with fear. In Brussels, policymakers have quietly admitted that Africa's economic redirection toward Asia could permanently reduce European leverage. Translation: Europe is losing its monopoly, and they're right. Because today, Africa doesn't need Europe to fund its future. It's financing itself through sovereign wealth funds, partnerships with Asia, and its own mineral exports. When China and Africa collaborate on infrastructure, both win. When India helps train African engineers, both grow. When Japan invests in Africa's digital economy, both innovate. That's partnership, not patronage. The Western playbook: destabilize, divide, dominate has expired. Africa is done being the pawn. It's now a player, and not just any player, a kingmaker in the global economic chessboard. Even the IMF and World Bank, once the unquestioned financial overlords of African economies, are losing their grip. African nations are turning to the BRICS New Development Bank for financing, an institution where Africa's voice matters. And guess what? The interest rates are fair. The conditions respect sovereignty. The loans build nations, not dependents. Europe is beginning to taste its own medicine. For years, it imposed trade barriers, patents, and colonial-era agreements that limited Africa's growth. Now, Africa is erecting its own trade walls, not to isolate, but to empower. The West called it protectionism. Africans call it self-respect. And this time, it's not just talk. Countries are implementing local content laws, banning raw exports, and mandating domestic processing. Europe's mining giants are fuming, but Africa's future generations are celebrating. Zimbabwe now refines its lithium domestically. Namibia processes its copper. Ghana refines gold and aluminum locally. Tanzania exports finished coffee, not raw beans. That's not defiance, that's destiny. The ripple effect is global. European factories dependent on cheap African minerals are slowing down. Energy prices in France and Germany are rising as Africa prioritizes its domestic needs. Africa's partnership with Asia is becoming the backbone of a new economic axis, one that does not need European approval. This alliance between Africa and Asia is more than trade, it's a philosophy. It's built on mutual respect, shared growth, and a rejection of exploitation. When African engineers work alongside Chinese counterparts to build solar grids, they exchange more than skills, they exchange dignity. When African universities partner with Indian tech institutes, they exchange more than research, they exchange futures. And this terrifies Europe because control has always been their lifeblood. Without it, they have nothing to offer. But Africa is no longer looking backward. It's building forward with Asia as an equal, not a master. The shift in global power didn't come with guns or sanctions, it came with contracts signed in boardrooms filled with African and Asian leaders, shaking hands over deals that Europe never saw coming. The sound that echoes across the corridors of Paris, Brussels, and Washington today is not the noise of African debt, please it. As the hum of African machinery, the roar of construction sites the rise of industries that once seemed impossible. From the deserts of Niger to the coasts of Mozambique, Africa is industrializing faster than any continent in modern history. And this time, the blueprint isn't European, it's African. The financing isn't dictated by Western lenders, it is negotiated on Africa's terms. The vision isn't imported, it's homegrown. Across Africa, new corridors of trade stretch like veins carrying lifeblood into a new body of prosperity, the East African Transport Network. Built in partnership with China, is moving millions of tons of goods between Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, linking economies that were once divided by colonial borders. In West Africa, the Trans-Sahel Railway, co-developed by African states with Indian and Russian engineers, connects Lagos to Dakar, moving goods, people, and dreams. These aren't just railways, they are arteries of independence. Europe cannot compete because it no longer understands Africa. It still sees a continent to be helped, while Asia sees a continent to be partnered with. When China builds ports in Djibouti or South Korea sets up solar farms in Senegal, they don't lecture Africans about democracy or governance. They discuss logistics, production, profit, and progress. In Ghana, the newly established Ghana Asia Industrial City has become the symbol of Africa's new economic awakening. There, factories run by African and Asian engineers produce everything from electric vehicles to medical equipment. Thousands of young Africans, once forced to migrate for opportunities, now find work at home. Meanwhile, European investors watch in silence, realizing their monopoly is gone. Let's be honest, Europe's relationship with Africa was never about partnership. It was about control. They took Africa's gold, diamonds, and oil. They dictated which crops could be grown and at what price they'd be sold. They made Africa depend on imports while forbidding industrialization. For over a century, the colonial legacy was designed to keep Africa in chains, economic chains disguised as aid. But now those chains are breaking because Africa has found new friends who understand the meaning of respect. China has built industrial parks that host African startups. India has invested in African pharmaceutical plants. Japan is constructing high-speed internet cables across the continent. Meanwhile, African leaders are demanding technology transfer, not charity. It's a new era of pragmatism where deals are sealed with steel and energy, not speeches and pity. And what's Europe's response? Panic diplomacy. You can see it in their rushed summits, the EU-Africa Partnership for Growth, France's new approach to Africa, Germany's compact with Africa. They call it partnership, but everyone knows it's desperation. The speeches are filled with promises, but the offers still the same: loans with conditions, aid with strings, and words without substance. Africa isn't buying it anymore. The new generation of African leaders, from Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim to Senegal's Bassirou Diomaye Faye, are not negotiating from a place of fear. They are negotiating from a position of strength. They no longer see Europe as a savior, but as a competitor, and Europe hates that. Because for the first time, Africa has leverage. Africa holds the minerals for the future: cobalt, lithium, nickel, graphite, the backbone of electric cars and clean energy. Without Africa's resources, Europe's green revolution is a fantasy. But Africa is no longer selling raw ore for pennies. It's processing it, refining it, exporting finished batteries and components, not just rocks, In Zambia and the DRC, Chinese and African engineers have built the first joint lithium processing facilities in sub-Saharan Africa. Ghana is building a gold refinery that supplies its own central bank. Kenya is exporting solar panels built by African technicians. Ethiopia is producing textiles for Asian and African markets, bypassing Europe entirely. And guess what? The profits are staying in Africa. Europe's economic planners are terrified. Their industries dependent on African imports for centuries are facing shortages, rising costs, and collapsing influence. African nations, once used as a source of cheap labor and raw materials, now control access to key commodities. It's poetic justice the colonized have become the controllers. Meanwhile, in Western media, a new narrative is being spun. They call it China's exploitation of Africa. They call it Asian dominance. But Africans see through the lie. They know what exploitation looks like, and this isn't it. What's happening is collaboration, investment, and empowerment, the very things Europe denied Africa for centuries. In the last decade alone, over 100 major African infrastructure projects have been completed with Asian collaboration. Roads, bridges, industrial plants, dams, and ports, all symbols of a new future, and more. Importantly, they're owned by Africans. But the biggest transformation isn't physical, it's psychological. Africans no longer see themselves as dependent. They see themselves as powerful. They've realized that global politics is not about friendship, it's about interests. And for the first time, Africa's interests come first. That's why Europe's threats no longer work. When France tried to pressure Mali with sanctions after it expelled French troops, Mali responded by signing a military and economic pact with Russia. When the EU tried to block African exports, Africa responded by expanding trade with Asia. When the US attempted to lecture African leaders about democracy, they reminded Washington of its own history of coups, invasions, and exploitation. Africa has changed. The youth of the continent are not begging for visas anymore, they're rebuilding their own future. The entrepreneurs, engineers, and visionaries of Africa are turning the continent into the world's next economic engine, and the West knows it. Why do you think the tone has shifted in European policy circles? They no longer talk about helping Africa. They now talk about competing in Africa. The language has changed because the power dynamic has changed. For centuries, Europe dictated Africa's terms. Now, Africa dictates Europe's future. Because without Africa's rare earth minerals, Europe's electric vehicle industry dies. Without Africa's agricultural exports, Europe's food prices soar. Without Africa's markets, Europe's consumer goods stagnate. Africa is no longer the periphery, it's the center. This is why the new alliance between Africa and Asia is so powerful. It's not just trade, it's transformation. It's a rebalancing of history. In the coming decade, the world will no longer be divided into developed and developing. It will be divided into self-reliant and dependent, and Africa is choosing self-reliance. China knows that a strong Africa means a stable global south. India knows that African industrial growth boosts global trade. Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam are entering African markets with respect and cooperation. The message is clear. The future belongs to those who work with Africa, not over Africa. Europe's colonial dream has collapsed, and it's collapsing faster than anyone expected. Even the financial systems that once enslaved Africa are being rewritten. African countries are creating digital currencies backed by gold and resources. Trade between African and Asian nations is increasingly conducted in local currencies, bypassing the US dollar and the euro. For the West, that's economic heresy. For Africa, it's independence. The symbolism is staggering. For over a century, Africa was forced to use currencies that symbolized its subjugation. Today, it's minting currencies that symbolize its sovereignty, and the world is watching. The IMF, the World Bank, and the European Central Bank are warning of global economic instability. But Africans call it balance. For the first time, the scales are leveling. The rise of Africa's alliance with Asia has shattered the myth that Africa needs Europe to succeed. The truth is the opposite: Europe needs Africa to survive. As African economies diversify, as manufacturing takes root, as trade corridors open eastward, the once dominant European influence fades like a shadow at sunrise. The old empires are gone, the new alliances are born, and this time Africa holds the pen that writes the future. This is not just about economics, it's about destiny. Because when Africa partners with Asia, it's not just building railways and ports, it's building pride, it's building dignity, it's building a new global order, one where the colonizer no longer dictates, and the colonized no longer obeys. Europe's greatest fear is not losing access to resources, it's losing control over Africa's mind. Because when Africans realize they can stand without Europe, the illusion of Western superiority collapses forever. And that's what's happening now in every deal, in every factory, in every trade corridor stretching from Cairo to Cape Town. Africa's future is no longer a promise, it's a process. A process fueled by partnership, powered by production, and protected by pride. The sun is setting on Europe's era of dominance, and the dawn rising over Africa is brighter than ever, powered by its people, its allies, and its unbreakable resolve to own its destiny.